Welcome to Spooky Interviews from Spooky Ventures. This week's interview, Rob Poyton of Innsmouth Gold. Let's talk first about your music. How would you describe the type of stuff you create, and how do you work toward creating a spooky feeling within your music?
I've released 3 albums so far under Innsmouth Gold. 2 of them relate to Lovecraft and the third one relates to Robert E. Howard. And there's 2 things really I've been trying to do. One is to create a soundscape or a soundtrack, sometimes to a complete story, or sometimes, in the case of Call of Cthulhu, a particular scene within the story. So in that one it's the swamp ritual in Call of Cthulhu, which is described by Inspector Legras, I think. And what I've tried to do is, I normally start with a musical theme, something that fits the general atmosphere given when the story is set and everything else, and then in and around that I try to put in some special effects. So that could be like a chanting or some kind of monster effect, or even background effects like wind, thunder, that sort of thing. The best fun is making the chants and the monster effects. I've been slowing down whale song, speeding up dolphin song, playing things backwards, and then adding in my own chanting, which I think has probably got the neighbours a bit concerned, but you know, it's all good fun. So that's the main thing, but then on each album I like to put in a couple of more sort of fun or humorous tracks as well, like the Miskatonic scale, because I think Lovecraft's sense of humour is often overlooked and underrated. So I think it's nice to put something in there also that's a little tongue-in-cheek. With the Robert E. Howard album Samaria, I also wanted to work in some of his poetry. I enlisted the help of John Brzezinski from New England, who's a great voiceover artist. He read some of the poems for me. Again, really for those, it was just putting in a nice, subtle, supporting background theme that fit. I think there was the poem Samaria, for example, or Solomon Kane's Homecoming, so that was a little bit more sort of Elizabethan pastiche music, just to really try and set the tone to support the spoken word.
You have also been involved in both book and art production. Can you talk a bit about that?
I've been involved in publishing since probably the early 90s. I was trained up in desktop publishing, and at the time that was to help produce newsletters for the company I was working for. From there I went into publishing magazines. Specifically I was involved in martial art magazines, publishing 2 magazines, and later on when I started getting more into writing and looking into self-publishing especially, that knowledge became very useful, because one thing I found now is the technology makes it so easy to self-publish. Even 10 years ago it was quite expensive. You had to order a set amount of books, and of course you end up with boxes of books in the shed or the garage. Now with print on demand it's very simple. I forward a PDF file to my printer and I can order 1 copy or 50 copies whenever I need them. So the technology has made that process much easier these days, and also price wise much less expensive as well. My wife is a graphic designer, an artist. She has her own range of craft products. She produces Christmas cards, designs for mugs, t-shirts, personalised designs, all sorts of things. And I'm trying to co-opt her more and more into doing some designs for Innsmouth Gold as well. Because again, with the technology now, it's so easy to put things on a t-shirt, to produce nice posters, all that kind of thing as well. So that's something else we're looking to get into a bit more in the future as well.
You are currently working on a Lovecraftian anthology. What should our viewers know about that?
Yes, this is a new book. We're just in the sort of first planning stages at the moment. It's going to be called Ancestors and Descendants, and it's going to be an anthology of short stories and possibly poems as well. And the theme throughout the book is either sequels or prequels to some of Lovecraft's stories. That may be the well-known stories, or it may be some of the lesser-known ones. We've got half a dozen writers on board already. I'm just waiting to get a few more confirmations in, and then we're going to be going ahead, maybe looking at a Kickstart campaign to get it all up and running. And I think so far we've got prequels to Rats in the Walls, Pickman's Model, and I think something possibly around The Shadow over Innsmouth as well. So it's looking good. I don't think it's an idea that's been done before. I may be wrong on that. So I'm really looking forward to getting all these stories in, reading through them, and then putting a nice anthology together.
Do you remember when you first became fascinated with the horror genre or spooky things in general?
I was born in the early 60s, 1963 to be precise, and looking back now, I think I was lucky. I grew up in this sort of golden age of horror, science fiction, TV, because we had the Hammer horror films, of course, at that time, the Munsters, the Addams Family, and I remember as well the Universal monsters. There seemed to be a bit of a revival going on. And I distinctly remember as a kid collecting bubblegum that came with these cards, and it was all stills from the old Boris Karloff, the Mummy, Dracula, the Wolfman, with all these humorous little captions underneath. So that was a very early memory and something that caught my interest. I also remember as a kid having the Aurora glow-in-the-dark kits, which I'd make with my dad and then we'd paint them, and that was things like Frankenstein. I think the Phantom of the Opera was one, the Hunchback, and of course you paint these things up, then put them in your bedroom, then lay there terrified in the night at this thing that's glowing in the dark. So again, that was something else that was a very early interest. The other thing at that time growing up then, especially in the late 60s and early 70s, was even kids' TV was scary. We had series like Paper House, Children of the Stones, we had things like Doctor Who, and in general culture there seemed to be a big interest in witchcraft, paganism, the occult, and I guess that all fed my interest in vampires, ghosts, horror and everything else. And then a little after that, then we started getting the paperbacks coming in, people like James Herbert, all that type of stuff as well. So I think I grew up in some ways in a golden age of horror, so perhaps it's only natural that I developed that kind of interest. Maybe I'm totally unnatural, who knows.
Do you have a favorite medium, be that print or film or other, for horror?
Not really, I don't think so. I think the important thing is whatever medium you're watching or reading or listening to works. And of course these different mediums will work in different ways. Some people say that Lovecraft is very difficult to translate from written word to film, for example. Possibly, maybe, but I think some people have really captured a good Lovecraftian essence in movies. The Thing is probably a good example, and the Call of Cthulhu from the HPL Historical Society, for example. So no, I wouldn't say I have one particular favourite. I read a lot, I watch a lot of movies and TV. One other sort of medium that I would mention is spoken word. In terms of, I listen to a lot of podcasts and maybe sometimes audio books, but spoken word in terms of performance, that can work very well as well. We quite often go to see a guy called Robert Lloyd Parry, otherwise known as Nunky, who does dramatised readings of M.R. James stories and is also doing Lovecraft now. He started with Pickman's Model. So you normally go and see him in an old chapel or church somewhere, and it's very simple. He sits in an armchair and there's a small table with a glass of whiskey and some candles, and he doesn't read the stories because he's memorised them. He speaks them, almost as though he were M.R. James himself. This is what James used to do, right, at Cambridge, reciting his ghost stories to the assembled people at Christmas. So that sort of combination of the atmosphere, the gloomy lighting, I suppose it's a very intimate setting, there's maybe 20 people there with you watching this person tell the story, and of course the way he performs it and dramatises it as well, it's not just a dry reading. That's a very effective medium as well. And I guess that's the oldest medium, right? People sitting around the campfire telling spooky stories. That's probably the oldest medium that we have. So yeah, that's a very effective one.
Who are some of your favorite horror creators?
In terms of art, I would say people like H.R. Giger. I think he is technically innovative and disturbing, very disturbing in equal measures, and very original as well, very original style. If we go back a few centuries, I love things like Hieronymus Bosch, that type of picture, and there was another guy, I can't remember the name at the moment, he did paintings, one in particular I think was called The Triumph of Death, which was armies of skeletons attacking and killing people. I guess that was around the same time as Bosch. And a lot of those of course were used as album covers by bands like Black Sabbath and that sort of thing. So they caught my eye at quite a young age.
What are some of your favorite horror books?
Well, there's the classics of course, the Lovecrafts and the Poes and the M.R. James we've already mentioned. When I was growing up, as I said before, we had things like James Herbert coming in with The Rats and The Fog. Guy Smith was another big name at the time. There were a lot of creature features going around. The rats, the crabs, the bats, the mice, the whatever. I guess Jaws spawned a lot of that type of writing. But then also the more occult writers as well. Dennis Wheatley was another favourite, particularly The Haunting of Toby Jug. For anyone who's got mild or strong arachnophobia, then that is a real terrifying book.
What about your favorite horror movies?
Favourite movies? If I had to choose a kind of top 5-ish, then John Carpenter's The Thing would definitely be in there. Romero's Dawn of the Dead, which I think was not only a great horror film, but an amazing piece of social commentary as well, very much ahead of its time. For British horror, then we've got the Hammer films, I spoke about before, almost anything with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. The Wicker Man, that's a great British movie. Phibes, probably, again, definitely a top 5 film, either of the Dr. Phibes films or maybe both of them. I think that's Vincent Price on top form. And speaking of Vincent Price, if we also go back to the Corman Poe features as well, Mask of the Red Death, again, that'd be another favourite. If we go back even further, then another top 5, I'm probably well over 5 now, shall we call it top 10? Another top 10 would be the original Nosferatu. I think even to this day I don't think anyone has quite captured that sense of otherworldliness that Max Schreck got with, let's face it, minimal effects and minimal makeup. I still think that's one of the outstanding horror performances. And as an offshoot of that, a more recent film was Shadow of the Vampire, which was a telling of the making of Nosferatu, and it was William Dafoe playing Nosferatu. And the twist in the tale, of course, is that the producer, I think it was Murnau, discovers that Nosferatu is actually a real vampire who is slowly eating his way through the film crew. That's a real nice movie as well.
Have you created works in other areas beyond horror, spooky territory?
Yes, at the moment under Innsmouth Gold I have 3 volumes in a sword and sorcery series called The Wolf Who Would Be King. About a month ago we just released volume 3 in that, Wolf in the North, and that is very much a Robert E. Howard Conan type homage fantasy series. I'm also just working on the 2nd volume in a military sci-fi series, Assault Team 5. The first volume was called Naylor's War, and that's about a special forces unit set about 200 years in the future. Outside of that, in terms of martial arts, I've got about 6 books out on various aspects of health, fitness and martial arts training, and also quite a lot, probably somewhere around the region of 50 or so download films now, again on various different aspects of martial arts training. I mentioned my music earlier as well through Wardrobe Records. I've put out about, I think there's about 4 or 5 albums. I mentioned those 2 bands, The Phobias, One Truth, but there's some other projects there as well, a kind of space rock album, a heavy dub album, and we've got some other releases planned for that later this year as well.
If you could sit down to dinner With any three people, living or dead, with whom would you be dining and what would be on the menu?
Well, that's quite a tough question. I guess if we were working in just the sort of spooky or horror type weird fiction field, I'd have to be quite obvious and go for the big three: Lovecraft, Howard and Smith. I think I'm right in saying that although they corresponded a lot during their lives, they never actually met face to face. So that would be something, to be at a meeting of those three, just to sit back and listen to them talk about all the various subjects they like to talk about. That would be an amazing experience. And on the menu, I guess it would have to be, for Mr. Lovecraft, some really nice ice cream.
What else would you like the viewers to know about that we haven't touched on in this interview?
Other than that, if you'd like to take a look at my books, they're available on Amazon and through all the usual outlets. You can also go direct to my website at innsmouthgold.com. As well as the books, there's those 3 CDs or downloads there: Illustrations of Madness, Ritual and Dream are the Lovecraft ones, and then Samaria is the Robert E. Howard album. There'll probably be a 4th one due out maybe towards the end of the year. I'm working on something around Clark Ashton Smith possibly, but we'll see how that goes. If you'd like to look more at my music, the phobias especially, you might be interested in from a horror angle, then that's at wardroberecords.net. So I'd just like to thank Gary for giving me the opportunity to do this interview. It's been fun talking, and I hope you enjoy my ramblings. And please remember, never go down into the cellar alone.
Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.